안녕하세요. 하나증권 글로벌 전략실 최연경입니다.
안녕하십니까. 리서치센터의 김현수입니다.
오늘은 미국에서 먼 길을 따라 하나증권에 방문해 주신 매드부시의 대표 테크주 애널리스트 댄 아이브스를 모셨습니다. 댄 아이브스는 한국 투자자분들이 가장 뜨겁게 사랑하고 있는 테슬라, 애플, 마이크로소프트 등을 커버하고 계시는데요. 이 자리를 통해 평소에 시청자분들이 궁금해하실 만한 미국 주식에 대한 질문을 드려보는 시간을 가져보기에 앞서 그 전에 간단하게 시청자분들을 위해 자기소개를 한번 부탁드리겠습니다.
Look, I've covered tech stocks since late 90s, from a Wall Street perspective. And, I think our reputation with both institutional as well as retail investors is really not just being, I'd say, perma-bullish, but understanding the tech themes, who the winners are, and sticking with them. And I think our DNA has always tried to been not to get caught up in sometimes macro events, especially when bears could very easily scare the bulls. And that really speaks to our thesis on names like Apple, Tesla, Microsoft, and big tech over the last few decades being bullish.
Well, let's dive into your professional field right away. And then, so my first question is going to be, I see that there are always high valuation and volatility in tech market. Could you describe the recent trend on tech industry and also on recent trend and developments? Are there any emerging sectors that we should particularly focus on, or the sectors where we should consider reducing our exposure?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, I'd say part of how I kind of view this AI revolution playing out, tech valuations, we've seen it with Godfather of AI, Jensen, NVIDIA, as well as other names like Microsoft and really across the Mag 7. Valuations have increased significantly, but I believe it's warranted. And I view this as much more of a 1995 moment, start of the internet, rather than a 1999 tech bubble moment. I think from an investor perspective, it's really trying to understand who are the second, third, fourth derivatives of AI. I think software, cybersecurity, and especially, parts of the semi-food chain are really going to be some of the major beneficiaries of this, what we estimate is $1 trillion of incremental AI CapEx. It's not just about NVIDIA and Microsoft. And we continue to believe it's 9 p.m. in the AI party that goes to 4 a.m.
That's a great term to describe. It's really interesting. Okay, well, moving on to your covering sector, especially which most Korean investors are hugely big fan of or unfavorable, Tesla. To be honest, we hear many areas of concerns with Tesla these days. And this year, Tesla stock has experienced significant volatility with a notable decline compared to last year, first half 23. What are the factors or business challenges that Tesla is facing these days? And what could be their countermeasure responses in order to overcome?
Tesla and Musk, it was a Cinderella ride from 2018-19, really up to last year. But the reality is that electric vehicles, which is well known, the blooms come off the rose. We've seen demand soften in China as well as globally. It's hurt Tesla. But I believe Tesla is kind of in between two growth waves. I think they're really going into what I view as much more of an AI robotics piece of the story, Robotaxi Day, which will be at October 10th. This has really been a near-term pain for long-term gain. It's been tough, obviously, for the stock, but I don't believe this is the end of this ride in Tesla. I actually think the next step really starts with the historical October 10th Robotaxi Day, because I believe autonomous alone could be $1 trillion of value in the Tesla story.
Well, okay, regarding that, your replies, what level Tesla platform strategy for autonomous driving project currently is, and when will we start to see the valuation of Tesla as an autonomous driving company?
This has been a rocky road, and look, autonomous, I could argue, is probably from a technology perspective one of the most difficult things to actually perfect, and especially given what we see from a regulatory perspective when you're dealing with transportation agencies. We believe Tesla, especially with its latest betas version, has made significant progress from an FSD perspective. The question is when you go from level 3 to level 4 and ultimately level 5, this is going to be a step function. I think over the next year, they're going to make significant strides in terms of all the technology that we see. But I believe robotaxi is going to be, from a revenue perspective, that really is going to create a whole nother leg to the Tesla story. And when you talk about autonomous, I mean, that is really, if you own Tesla today, you're really owning it for the autonomous and FSD future rather than just a traditional EV car company. And I've never viewed Tesla as a traditional auto company. Always viewed them as a disruptive technology player.
I see. I guess a lot of some of the investors are going to be excited to hear the news and catch up the updates on October, the event day. Right?
Yeah, and we'll be there in LA at Robotaxi Day, and I think with Tesla, the haters are going to continue to hate as they always have, but the next part of the story now is going to be autonomous, and I could also argue demand is stabilized, especially in China. We've seen margins obviously significantly compressed, but I think we're, call it 97, 98% there, where the worst is in the rearview mirror.
Got it, thank you. Since there are so many fans of Tesla stock in Korea, could you provide advice on key metrics or strategies that Tesla investors should focus on?
In terms of how many they actually sell per quarter, I do believe that some of that you kind of lose the broader story. It's very easy to say, okay, they miss units in a quarter. That's super negative. But then it comes down to price. Because look, they've cut price significantly. That's hurt margins. If you look at what I'll call gross margins X credit, let's just call that, historically that was mid-20s. Now it's kind of been mid-teens. And that's actually probably been the biggest negative part of the story, is that compression. So I think as margins start to goes back up toward 20%, which we believe starts into next year, the trajectory where there'll be about 2 million, about 500,000 per quarter run rate. And then ultimately it's going to be about FSD penetration, the software piece, because software is the key margin piece of the Tesla story. Company has 25-30 billion in cash, so they are in a phenomenal position. But now it's really about the growth story, and I continue to view them as the most undervalued AI play in the market.
You also cover Rivian and GM too. I analyzed the battery industry, so I'd like to hear about your outlook for our clients like GM and Rivian.
Yeah.
Because recently the sales performance of Korean battery companies has been differentiated based on the electric vehicle sales situation of certain customers. So how do you see the growth potential of electric vehicle sales for the emerging companies like Rivian or other legacy automakers like GM, apart from Tesla?
Great. And it's great talking. I know you do a ton of great work on the battery side. Look, Rivian's tale of two cities, right? The demand's outstripping supply 5-1. In terms of what we've seen from a customer perspective. The big issue for RJ and Rivian has just been the supply chain. Supply chain's been a huge issue for Rivian. I mean, obviously we went through that with Tesla. But I believe Rivian's a survivor. I think there's a category that there's no reason they can't get to that scale, 100,000 units and eventually 200,000 units, and so on per year. But their big issue has been navigating the supply issue. So I think Rivian, it's actually a great demand story. Supply's been the issue. Now, when it comes to Detroit and what we've seen from GM with Ultium, and I even broaden that out, what we've seen with Ford and Stellantis, huge ambitions from an EV perspective. The reality is demand's been soft. And I think they've kind of pivoted on the vision much more toward a hybrid type model. I think EVs, when we look out for GM, I think EVs at one point will contribute 15-20% overall sales. But it's not going to be 40-50%. And I think that's something where the street has actually been positive in terms of how GM has kind of communicated it. Now for them is trying to be successful on traditional EVs, and they have a huge lineup, and besides Lyric and others, but also on the hybrid model. And I think a lot of that's been reflected in the stocks. You know, goes back to like what you talked about on the Korean battery side. It went from a Cinderella ride to, you know, a horror show, Michael Jackson Thriller video, whatever you want to talk, you know, in terms of where that went down. But now I think we've gotten back to a good place.
So I'm also curious about the effect of policy changes in the U.S. Because, you know, after the U.S. government's announcement of easing emissions regulations about 4 months ago, have there been any noticeable changes in GM's electric vehicle production plans over the next 2 to 3 years?
Yeah, I mean, if you look from production, look, in terms of the plants and their strategy, production, in terms of the trajectories, actually looks pretty strong. And they'll, at their analyst day in October, I think they're going to talk more about it. I think for them, it's just trying to understand what the demand looks like. Look, and then presidential election coming up, Trump clearly negative for EVs. That'd be negative for GM because the rebate would be taken away, the $7,500. And then the bigger problem for the GM and Fords and others is that U.S. government, I mean, you look, you have, essentially if you look, you have 100,000 charging stations today in the U.S. You really need to get the 20% penetration, 400,000 to 500,000. Infrastructure hasn't been there. It's carrot and the stick. So these are all things that I think it's going to be a key few months ahead, not just in terms of the election, but in terms of like what we see with dollars going toward that infrastructure.
I'm also curious about your outlook for Tesla's energy business. Tesla's ESS installation volume in second quarter more than doubled compared to the previous quarter. So how do you see the growth potential?
You know, it's like I don't view that the stock even reflects any of that. I do think, look, 2Q, the energy storage number, and even on the margin side, that stood out. I actually think investors are starting now to look at that business, given the trajectory, because we actually think that's one like incrementally could be actually a big growth driver and margin driver. And they're going to be in a position of strength, especially when you look at the Detroit 3 more and more going to Tesla from supercharger and really from a charging infrastructure. Tesla has essentially replaced the U.S. government, you know, when you actually think how that's all played out from an infrastructure perspective. Look, I think there's a lot of upside that could happen on the storage business and just broader sum of the parts, robotaxi, everything else. But I do believe storage is an undervalued piece of the Tesla story.
The state has Apple. We heard that Apple's new iPhone 16 will be released by next week, which I am very excited to try out the new version. The biggest topic across the entire IT industry right now is AI, and Apple has been somewhat of a latecomer in the AI field. So, and despite having large market cap in the world, Apple stock has been showing quite different movement compared to NVIDIA this year. How do you think Apple will advance with AI technology, and what's your view on Apple Intelligence?
Yeah, so look, I think it's probably one of the most important things across all of tech, because as much as NVIDIA has been the torchbearer of the AI revolution, you know, led by Godfather of AI, Jensen, Apple's been late, but we ultimately believe now the consumer AI revolution, I mean, 25% of consumers in the world will access AI through an Apple device. When you look at Apple Intelligence, the OpenAI partnership, the A18, chip, this is really going to spark what we believe is an AI-driven supercycle for Apple. And the reason also that is 300 million of 1.5 billion iPhones haven't upgraded in 4+ years. So you have Samsung is competitive, of course in China, Huawei and others. But I don't care if it's China, New York, Berlin. Consumers want the best device in the world. And Apple, I really kind of view them as, call it 2-3 years ahead of where Huawei is. But it goes back to they were late. But with 2.2 billion iOS devices and 1.5 billion iPhones, they can be late as long as they're right and they have that install base. And I think that's the opportunity. We think $30 to $40 per share is what AI adds to the Apple story.
I see. I guess that's one of the advantages that Apple has, because Apple has so many users, and also it has to differentiate some skills to differentiate to compete the competitors, or has specialty within Apple services.
Apple plays chess. Cupertino and Cook play chess. Others play checkers at the little kids' table.
Okay.
So the point is, like, that's why Apple is where they are. And even though competition continues to go out, 99.3% of Apple users around the world, once you go Apple, you don't go back. So I think that continues to be the strength, services, and now AI. And look, and I view it as betting against Cook and Cupertino into an AI-driven supercycle. I mean, it's like betting against Messi, LeBron, Djokovic. I mean, name your sort of sports icon. That's how I view betting against Apple into the supercycle.
I see. Would there be extra room for maximizing the additional gross profit margin of Apple's services, even though it is already showing high margin in their services, in their service entity?
Yeah, and services double the margins of the hardware business. And we believe services is actually worth, and I think this is how many investors have missed it. We think the services piece is worth 1.6 to 1.7 trillion. And that's how, when you look at Apple, be like, oh, the innovation is in the rearview mirror. It comes down to the services penetration continues to increase. And despite antitrust and some other worries out there, this has really essentially been not just a mid-teen grower, but a huge driver of the valuation when you look back the last few years. And I think that's how many bears sitting in hibernation mode deep in their caves, they look at their spreadsheets and they continue to, I think, not be able to figure out the services piece. And just take a step back. Some of the parts, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, everything we see with Nadella and Redmond, the cloud piece. Apple, no different. Some of the parts continues to be, I think, the theme in tech.
Last question for the Apple. Regarding iPhone sales, it is understood that performances in targeting the India market has been favorable. I think Apple has made good moves in response to sales downturn in China. What are the next major target region and countries that Apple might look on?
Yeah. Look, China's the hearts and lungs of the Apple story. So it was a huge tailwind. It was a headwind given geopolitical and what we've seen with Huawei as well. We believe this was their last negative quarter. That will start to be a growth market. Everything we're seeing from our checks in the supply chain. When you look at broader, like the Apple story, I believe now the sort of next leg starts to play out. You look at India. Look, India's been 3% iPhone sales. We think that's 10% in the next 2 years. It's not replacing China, but with a rising middle class, they finally have started to find success in India. But let's just be clear. For Apple to hit a $4 trillion market cap, which is where I think it is in the next 3 to 6 months, it's China that will get it there.
How do you think about the Apple Car business? As you know, they announced canceling of their Apple Car project about 6 months ago. But do you think they could restart their automotive business?
I think there's a better chance of me playing in the NBA than Apple restarting their car business. Because now again, I do have a decent jump shot, but whatever. The point is, that was, I think, good intentions, but ultimately a bit of a nightmare for investors, just because that was never going to be Apple's core. Now look, but there's a lot of skunk works that happens within Apple that never see the light of day outside Apple Park. I believe at one point down the road they could partner with an OEM. But right now for Apple, you want all the focus on AI. Just like with Zuckerberg and Meta, Metaverse, that's deep in the closet behind some wedding album, door shut. They're focused on AI. And I think they've heard investors loud and clear in terms of that piece.
Well, should we talk about Microsoft now? I found out that OpenAI has become very much a prominent and active entity today. Recently, it was revealed that OpenAI plans to receive about $1 billion. And it is reported that NVIDIA is negotiating to invest $100 million too. Given this trend of big tech companies pursuing stakes in OpenAI, what impact do you think this might have on Microsoft? Would there be updates with the significant partnership they have with Microsoft?
Yeah, I mean, look, Altman and OpenAI, it's the golden child of the AI revolution. Nadella was the only one that understood. I mean, he's a grandmaster poker player, which is why he understood the value of OpenAI. That $10 billion has paid for itself 40 times over in terms of that initial investment. NVIDIA, Apple, everyone in a Game of Thrones battle, everyone's going to want a piece of OpenAI. But I think it is more entrenched in Microsoft. There is some sort of co-opetition that could happen. But when you look at the AI revolution, as much as it's led by Jensen and NVIDIA from a chip perspective, Microsoft from a hyperscale perspective really owns that. Now Google and Kurian have clearly gained share, Amazon, Jassy as well. But Microsoft, in that Mount Rushmore of AI, it's Jensen, Nadella.
Last but not least, regarding the CrowdStrike incident that happened in the last July, is there a shift in the cybersecurity market trends? Like, for example, CrowdStrike has been benefiting by having a single cybersecurity provider in the past, but now do you think there will be any changes or impacts in this kind of trends? I mean, in this after this incident?
It was a black eye incident. Well, July 19th, it will be a dark day for cybersecurity industry. But when you look at CrowdStrike, like all of our checks show, I don't see too many customer departures. It is actually probably the best endpoint player out there. Palo Alto, SentinelOne could potentially benefit. I think their quarter they just had at Bark was a lot worse than the Byte. I think in terms of guidance, they'll have legal issues, shareholder lawsuits. But look, you take a step back, it does speak to like what's happened in the cybersecurity industry. I mean, it is very fragmented, but a Microsoft, a Google, and Amazon, they haven't really gone after acquisitions. Google, was going after Wiz. Does this potentially be a catalyst when Microsoft goes after M&A? Possible. But I believe CrowdStrike's a good example of, it's a name that we're bullish on, Palo Alto, Zscaler, and others. Sometimes these things come through and you think it's the end of these companies. But the install bases are just too strong. Yeah. I also think George did a good job navigating, a really almost a once in a 15-year type of incident.
I have one more question.
Definitely.
How do you think about the Tesla's battery business? They announced about three years ago on Tesla's battery day. It will produce their own battery cells. So, do they will produce their own batteries without cell makers? I mean, do you think they will produce their own batteries, fully internalization?
Yeah. I mean, look, is there an ambition? Maybe. But as someone like myself that's been to Giga in Nevada many times, just given the partnerships they have, the entrenched part. I just don't see it. I also think for Tesla, those ambitions, battery efficiency, costs, and everything, you know probably better than anyone, a lot of it really just comes down to like softer demand for EVs. That's kind of gone a little further into the background. But I believe partnerships are going to continue to be the name of the game for them, just given, I think a lot more of the focus is going to be on autonomous FS in terms of where I see some of those innovations. But you will have innovation on the battery side. I just think it's been slower to come by.
Right. I'd like to say thank you again. I really appreciate your showing up on our Hana YouTube channel. I look forward to seeing you on other various media platforms, and I will be always cheering on your interview. Well, thank you so much, Dan.
No, and thanks for this great conversation. I think it's just the start of everything we're seeing here in Korea as part of just a broader tech trade.
짧은 시간을 통해서 평소에 한국 투자자분들이 관심 있을 법한 미국 시장과 최근의 테크 관련 사회 이슈를 알아보았는데요. 굉장히 유익했고 시장에 대해 보다 세밀하게 알게 된 것 같습니다. 이 기회를 통해서 댄 아이브스 분께 출연해 주셔서 감사하다는 말씀 드리고요. 귀한 시간 내주신 김현숙 과장님께도 감사의 말씀 드리며 마무리하겠습니다.